Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this PaTTAN Pennsylvania Department of Education co-sponsored event um, as part of our work and commitment to supporting equity across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. We're very excited to have Dr. Ron Whittaker here today, and you're going to hear more about him and the expertise that he will be sharing with us in a few moments. And we're also very honored to have our Secretary of Education, Noe Ortega, here also, who will be providing some comments. But my purpose today is to honor someone who has been leading this work in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania for going on 3 years. Dr. Nicole Holland-Sims has been a liaison to the Pennsylvania Department of Education for all things equity under Secretary Rivera's leadership and now supporting Dr. Ortega. Nicole's work is unparalleled, and her commitment, especially during these unprecedented times, to ensure educators across Pennsylvania have the tools they need to support our students has been recognized not only here in Pennsylvania, but also nationally. Nicole is an educational consultant here at the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistant Network. And in addition to her work supporting equity, she currently serves as our co-statewide lead for the Behavior Initiative, which focuses on the resources teachers need to implement positive behavioral supports and interventions in our schools, as well as what social emotional resources and tools we can provide educators in the classroom. As an active member also of our multi-tiered systems of support initiative, Nicole is coordinating efforts between how do we ensure that academics and social emotional supports are in place to support school improvement efforts across Pennsylvania. In addition to the statewide lead for equitable practices in partnership with the Office of Safe Schools, Dr. Holland-Sims is also involved in our state systemic improvement plan with a focus on increasing the graduation rates of students with disabilities. What Nicole also brings to the table is the fact that she is a certified school psychologist with a special interest in social justice. She has conducted research across caregivers of children of incarcerated parents and their motivation to engage in family and school partnerships. As we think about our classrooms and we think about, as educators, how we support kids, we know that COVID-19, racial and social inequities, and chronic stress show up in our classrooms. When we think about that, we need to think about trauma-informed practices that will ensure equity across our systems. And we couldn't be in better hands with Nicole coordinating those efforts. And as a part of the PaTTAN team, we are honored to call her one of our peers. When I think about our work and the power of our work to impact the lives of children, I think about a quote from Barack Obama when he says, "Change is brought about because ordinary people do extraordinary things." It's a credit to you today that you are here taking time out of your day, 1,000 educators from across Pennsylvania, to hear how they can better support all students in Pennsylvania. So with that, it is my honor to introduce our state lead for behavior at PaTTAN, Dr. Nicole Holland-Sims.
Dr. Kirby, just thank you so much. I'm humbled and honored to have this opportunity to share with all of you. And so with that, I can't be more excited than to have more than almost 1,000 people register for today's session. And so with that, I do want to begin by sharing my screen. I know you're probably going to hear that a lot today, as you've heard in the Zoomiverse as we talk about. So if you would just indulge me for 1 second, I just want to do a couple housekeeping items before I introduce our esteemed speakers. And thank you all for your patience, for giving us grace as we navigate this space. Again, with the amount of people, we just couldn't be happier. So again, I want to formally welcome you to H.E.L.P, a charge to become a drum major for equity and justice. I am so excited to hear from Dr. Ronald Whittaker. And this, as Dr. Kirby mentioned, is a Pennsylvania Department of Education and PaTTAN Equity Expert event. And so we're so thrilled to have you today. Just a few housekeeping items to keep in mind. Today's session will be presented in Zoom webinar. And so with that, that means that You don't have to worry about your camera being on. You don't have to worry about hitting the mute button quickly if you have any noise in the background. You are automatically muted and without video upon entry. The only videos and information that you will see will come from either myself, Secretary Ortega, Dr. Whittaker, and or my colleague, Amira Hill Yancey, who I am just so thrilled is my partner in this effort. And she also supports the PaTTAN East office around equity and will be supporting us today using our question and answer feature. So throughout the session, Dr. Whittaker has built in time, if there are questions throughout the session, that please use the Q&A feature to pose them. And between Amira and myself, we will ensure that they get to him at those specific times. We also know that this is an Act 48 approved event. And so if you have any questions about registration and or your Act 48 credits, please direct those questions to Tina Rife at trife@pattan.net. Thank you for that. And so what I'd like to do at this time is introduce our Acting Secretary of Education, Dr. Noe Ortega. And for a few moments, I'm going to go ahead and read his bio out for you. Noe Ortega was nominated to serve as Secretary of Education in October of 2020. Prior to his nomination, he had served as the Deputy Secretary and Commissioner for the Office of Post-Secondary and Higher Education at the Pennsylvania Department of Education. As Commissioner for Higher Education, he led the work of the agency aimed at closing the post-secondary attainment gaps that have persisted among historically underrepresented populations and communities of color in Pennsylvania. Additionally, Mr. Ortega facilitated the efforts of the department to improve the diversity of Pennsylvania's educator workforce and to ensure that every student of the Commonwealth has access to educators who have been trained in culturally responsive and culturally relevant approaches to teaching and learning in the classroom. Prior to joining PDE, Mr. Ortega spent 8 years at the University of Michigan, where he held several academic and administrative roles. During his tenure, he worked as the Assistant Director and Senior Research Associate at the National Center for Institutional Diversity and as the Managing Director for the National Forum on Higher Education for the Public Good. While most of his research focused on post-secondary access and success for all students, his most recent publications examine how public investment in higher education influences decision-making at colleges and universities. Additionally, Dr. Ortega spent nearly a decade working in the areas of financial aid and enrollment management at both public and private universities in Texas, and he also served as a P through 16 specialist for the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. Dr. Ortega also spent nearly 7 years as director of a language institute in Japan, where he trained teachers in the area of early childhood language acquisition. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our Acting Secretary, Noe Ortega. And before he begins, Connor, if you could spotlight Noe, that would be great.
Thank you, Connor. Thank you, Dr. Holland Sims and Dr. Kirby as well. It's an absolute honor to be able to share this virtual platform with some really good partners. I see Dr. Whittaker will be the feature speaker here today, an absolute great partner for the department and great advocate for a lot of the work that we've done. And I know everyone will enjoy his remarks and the ability to interact with him in a Q&A platform as well. Let me join the chorus of everyone welcoming you to that has welcomed you to today's event that is co-hosted by the Department of Education and the PaTTAN as well. This is part of a series of professional development for learning around equity. And I think it's going to be a really good opportunity for many of us to be among colleagues to share some of the information that will come out today as well from the presentations. I also want to begin, like I do every morning in my work, and just give everyone an opportunity to sort of reflect on the work, the good work that many of you have done as you continue to demonstrate resiliency, resolve with all the challenges and adversity that we've faced throughout the past 9 months, and for many of us doing this work throughout our careers. I think it's a really important thing to celebrate all the milestones amid all the things that we know we have to do. Lots of energy has always been placed on how much further we have to go, how much work there's still left to do. And often that comes at the expense of celebrating the accomplishments, the milestones that we've been able to achieve in our work as we've moved forward and navigated the pandemic in particular. So with that, I thank you on behalf of the department and want to encourage you to know that we will continue to put out support and resources to help you. I also want to share with you a little bit about our thinking at the department as well. We too continue to assess and evaluate the work that we've done through an equity lens, to begin on how we could be better at building conditions, promoting practices that really create the equitable environments that many of us would like to seek and create for our students who are on our campuses, right? These are also environments that would be filled with a good climate for educators as well. Many of the challenges that we face are not just about the learning in the classroom, but the support that we give teachers, educators, particularly our educators of color who need support, and continue to look to the department for guidance on ways that we might be able to also create scenarios where they can feel supported and successful in their work as well. So the department continues to do that. We are looking at promoting a number of things, some of them which is to rethink how we might be able to infuse equity across all our development platforms for our professionals. Think about ways that we could infuse equitable outcomes into things like regulations, things that we do around standards and curricula, certifications, how we think about disciplinary practices, hiring practices, grant making across all the work. It is our idea that if we're going to create situations where the work of equity is institutionalized, it should be present at the core of the institution. And so the department will continue to do that. And we always look out to our stakeholders to make sure that we can inform this with what's happening on the ground, with the needs and expectations that many of you have as well. I would be remiss if I didn't also offer up an opportunity to sort of reflect on some of the events that have transpired most recently. We happen to sit on the eve of an event that occurred a week ago today that really unsettled this nation and served to us as a reminder of the importance of this work. I want to sort of think about and share with you what this event represents to us, and to offer up some thinking, at least from me personally, with regards to how I'm making sense of many of the things. What I witnessed a week ago really explained to me that there's a level of distrust that exists that has many people questioning many of the institutions that were set up to protect us, to serve us, and to educate us. This has created a tremendous amount of tension when we think about these challenges, and we now have to find our way to rebuild and renew that trust. And the Department of Education is no exception to that. But for many of us, when we think about the events of last week, we've seen these events play out in different ways across the country. And I want to make sure that we're reminded on the importance of being able to reflect, make sense of them, and then to figure out what we're going to do as we move forward. These are events that transpired in Charlottesville just a few years ago, a reminder of some of the challenges that we face. These are events that have transpired around protests that we've seen around Black Lives Matter in a number of states, also arguing and contesting for changes in our society. And even recently, we saw events that transpired around the challenges that we witnessed with Mr. Walter Wallace Jr. as well. These are all events, when taken when they accumulate, really challenge many of us to begin to think, how can we begin to rebuild and renew trust in a number of institutions that were set up to protect, service, and educate us? As we think about the department, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to figure out how we can give students, teachers, educators, the tools, the skills necessary to make sense of the events and begin to learn from them. We also, as a department, don't hesitate from calling these events out for what they are. What we witnessed recently and what we've witnessed throughout the past several years in a lot of our work is really embedded in situations where we've seen racist practices play out across the country. This elevates the importance of the equity work that many of us are doing and continue to do. And this is why we're very pleased to say that it's become a really important part of our platform, has continued to be an important platform. Most recently, even the Wolf administration has made it a priority to put in place efforts that seek to dismantle systemic racism in our society. And it's our pleasure to be able to elevate a lot of the work that we're doing to help achieve this agenda. This is not just a moral imperative from the department. This is work that is going to change society for the better. And this is how we have to begin to talk about it. I think when we separate excellence of education from the things that happen around equity and talk about them differently, it does not help to promote the work and move it forward. And so it's important for us with our strategies, particularly around discourse, that we begin to weave those ideas together in order to be effective with the outcomes that we seek to achieve. There's another part of our work that I think is important that I want to make sure this narrative gets out in events like this. And this is to really understand the important role that education plays in really helping us move forward as a society. For so long, we've been talking about private good, transactional outcomes associated with the individual and educational attainment, right? Things like economic and social mobility, other things that tend to benefit the individual and puts them on a path for success. I don't want to take away from the importance of education in individual uplift, but I also want to lay emphasis on the fact that it is also about the public good, the collective outcomes associated with educational attainment. From completing secondary studies to moving into a post-secondary pathway that's curated for the choice of the individual. These are all things that are important to make folks into more productive contributors to a society. These are the things that are embedded with civic engagement of individuals. These are things that promote collective thinking in our society, things that have been necessary as we've navigated through this pandemic recently. It's been this entire time, as we've been dealing with things around COVID, it's been about other oriented approaches to our thinking and what we're doing. And I think these are the things that we need to reinstill into our understanding about education, right? This is why we think about the learning, the critical thinking, the tools cognitively needed to begin to make sense of the events that are playing out around us. And I think it's important that we remember that schools, whether they're our K through 12 schools, our early childhood schools, or our post-secondary institutions, play that role. They are the incubators for innovation. They are places where difficult dialogue should happen and where we should find the courage to be able to engage in difficult discussions so we can work our way through many of the challenges. So for us, this is the thinking that's infused in the way that we go about doing our work, promoting it, and engaging in events such as this. I hope that what I've offered for you today really gives you an anchor of where the department is thinking and where we're headed with a lot of our projects. Dr. Nicole Holland-Sims, Dr. Ron Whittaker, who's here today, Dr. Angela Kirby, and the numerous folks that have been part of these series, part of this work, including yourself as an engaged stakeholder, have only helped to make this work better. I want to acknowledge that this has been a challenging year, and many of you have done a tremendous job in responding commendably to many of the challenges that you've been faced with. You found ways to ensure that there's continuity of learning for students at all levels and at all ages. You found ways to take your profession and elevate it beyond even areas that maybe were within your comfort zone. Educators are now being asked to think like social workers, like psychologists, like epidemiologists in some cases, to really provide the services, in many cases, life-sustaining services to students and families. We've also learned that there's a culturally relevant and sustainable approach to our thinking as well, to look at the student with regards to their learning happening within the ecosystem and the environment that they find themselves in. I also want to acknowledge that it's our goal to keep working with our school leaders, our educators, and our partners, and even families and the communities to figure out how are we going to begin to move forward and work our way beyond the pandemic. And as we move forward, we're also going to ask ourselves, how can we begin to rethink what the ecosystem of education needs to look like as we move forward? For many of us, when we hear the question, when are we going to return back to normal? We don't necessarily feel very eager to go back to the way that things once were. They weren't equitable for many people. Access to learning has not been the same for everyone. Sure, it's been emphasized with regards to inequities around platforms related to remote learning and accessibility, but we've had inaccessible learning happening in communities of color for a very long time. And so going back to normal is not exactly the path that we need to be eagerly seeking. We need to be trying to configure how are we going to create a new environment of education that's conducive to equitable learning, that is inclusive to all folks who want to engage in it as well. And so these are the things that we're beginning to sort of wrap our hands around. I look forward to the continued dialogue that we get from events like this. Dr. Nicole Holland Sims has been a phenomenal drum major in this work, really capturing the needs of our stakeholders, elevating these into conversations at the core. We've even begun to meet quite regularly as a department with the executive leadership team to really challenge ourselves to embrace many of the values that we go out and publicly speak about. We want to practice what we preach. We want to transform the organization to make sure that it lives up to the expectations that many people have of us. And we also want to make sure that the department is aware of the voices that aren't always heard, that aren't always elevated, but also are in need of support, continued learning, and then to have advocates and champions for their causes as high as the levels of even the governor and folks surrounding the governor and the governor's cabinet. So I want to end by thanking everyone for what you've done and what you continue to do. The department is proud of the work that many of you are doing with your students and family. We know that each of you is a change agent. We both admire what you do at the ground level and respect what you give us in terms of advice, feedback, and input. And we hope that that partnership continues and that it evolves. It turns into something that's really going to be transformational to the department and to the work that we're trying to do. At this moment, I'd like to pass the baton, I guess, to build on the drum major metaphor, Dr. Holland Sims, back to you. And again, thank you for really inviting me into the space to allow to offer some remarks. And then I look forward to the remarks that happen from here on out. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Secretary Ortega. We're honored that you were able to take time today. I know it meant a lot to a great deal of us to hear your words. So thank you for your continuous support. Okay, now we are moving to Dr. Ronald Whittaker. And so what I'd like to do is give him a proper introduction. I can't say enough. I was able to hear Dr. Whittaker at an event that was put on by IU23 in the summertime. And at that time, I was just blown away. And I said, I need to get more information about this powerhouse. And so I'm so thankful that he has become a thought partner, someone that I consider to be esteemed in this work. And I'm just so honored that he decided to give his expertise to us today. I want to briefly highlight some things from his bio. He did tell me not to read it all the way out, even though I want to, but I do want to highlight some really great things so that you know the hands that you are about to walk into that are very capable. So Dr. Ronald Whittaker is known as an equity and anti-racist freedom fighter. Dr. Whittaker is the appointed culturally responsive pedagogy assistant professor of education and the director of the Center for Urban Education, Equity, and Improvement at Cabrini University. Further, Dr. Whittaker also holds the distinction of being a H.E.L.P Fellow at Duquesne University. As a H.E.L.P Fellow, Dr. Ron engages in improvement projects that seek to build system capacity within organizations. Additionally, Dr. Whittaker is the current Pennsylvania Department of Education equity expert, a Board of Trustees member for the Tacony Academy Charter School, and a Board of Directors member for the National Association of African Americans in Human Resources. Dr. Whittaker holds a plethora of degrees, and he comes to us highly, highly qualified. I do want to highlight that he has a forthcoming book that is coming out titled H.E.L.P, Helping Us to Understand It's Still Either Going to Be Chaos or Community. And so without further ado, I would love to turn it over to Dr. Whittaker. Welcome, Dr. Whittaker.
Well, thank you, Dr. Nicole Holland Sims, for the wonderful introduction. Most importantly, it's just an honor to be here. So How about this? Can I share my screen now? And I believe that I can. Thank you. If you give me 1 minute as I pick the screen up, and we are good to go. So again, colleagues, what an honor to be with you this morning. I do not take this for granted. The fact that we had over 900 register, I think has nothing to do with me, but most importantly, it has to do with where we are right now. So as much as I'm honored, I know that this is a huge responsibility that I have before me in terms of really arguing that we need to change. And I don't take this moment lightly. So the title of today's talk is H.E.L.P, a charge to become a drum major for equity and justice. So as mentioned, in many ways, some of the claims that I'm going to make in this presentation really comes from the forthcoming book. But again, that's going to make a whole lot of sense in a few minutes. Before I go any further, I know that we are in this season of using live stream and connecting virtually. So just want to give everyone a moment. If you want to continue the conversation with me personally, or if you want to continue the conversation today, maybe with your friends and colleagues across the country that would love to be a part of this discourse, there are a couple ways that we can connect. So via Twitter at DRRWW, I need to confess, I'm not tweeting as much. That said, I would love to find ways to be a little bit more engaged in the future. Also, CUEEICU1, if you're on Instagram at dr.ron.whittaker, and then my email, rwhitaker@cabrini.edu. A huge thank you once again to my colleague, Dr. Nicole Holland Sims, for the work that you are doing in the state of Pennsylvania. Another master educator that is with us this morning, Amira Hill Yancey, I thank you for your work. Noe Ortega, we thank you for the work that you are continuing to do in Pennsylvania, most recently in your new appointed role as the Secretary of Education. I know that you're going to do great work, so I thank you for your kind remarks also, and also just affirming the work that we're doing. PaTTAN colleagues, thank you. I know that this is a lot of work to organize and to make sure that everything goes smoothly, but most importantly to you, everyone that is here with us this morning for this very important conversation. I celebrate your work. So why is that important? It's important for a few reasons. Number one, we all realize that because of this age of COVID, we are under pressure, right? We are grinding, we are putting in more hours, we're having to think outside of the box. But not only that, many of us, we're dealing with our own stressors at home. So as you're trying to facilitate equitable practices for the students in the communities that you serve, at the same time, many of you are the parents, are playing the teacher to your own children, or perhaps you're now taking care of elderly parents. So I thank you. As mentioned, we're all working harder. So I just really appreciate the fact that you're here this morning to engage in this conversation as we're going to co-learn from one another. Let me also say this. As much as I have degrees and articles and I'm doing this work, this is not a top-down approach. We are co-learning from one another. Quite frankly, if one person or a group of people had the answer, we wouldn't even be here this morning. So I'm looking forward to this discourse. This is not going to be a 2-hour lecture. That's not going to happen. I start lecturing again in 2 weeks at Cabrini University. This is a conversation. So I just wanted to put that out there. So I need to, as much as my bio was read, I want to give a backdrop because I think it's going to situate the perspective and the lens that I'm going to come from this morning. So as mentioned, at Cabrini University, I have multiple roles. the culturally responsive assistant professor of education, the assistant dean in the School of Education. I'm also the director of district and school relationships, and also the director of the Center for Urban Education, Equity, and Improvement. I always say this, as much as we're talking about equity, I have 4 roles, but 1 paycheck. So that's a whole nother equity conversation. But as a critical scholar, I really write on these issues and I want to go deeper, right? And, as a result of me writing on these issues and going deeper, within my professional practice, I conduct countless professional development and symposiums around ways that we can really facilitate equitable practices, ways that we can get into substantive conversations around race and racism. But can I park the car there for a moment and say this? It's a journey. No one has arrived, right? As much as we think that we finally got to, let's just say, level 5, something happens that makes us rethink all of those steps that is taking us to get to level 5. So it's a journey. And within that journey, we have to have the courage to go deeper, to critically reflect, because quite frankly, without us going inward, we're never going to be able to change some of the things that we're seeing externally. So, all that to say, I aspire for my work to be deeper than what's in my bio. So as I think a little bit in terms of who am I and what do I do? For some people, I'm an anti-racist educator, right? I teach courses, I write on this issue. For others, perhaps those that I consult with, I'm a DEI strategist. In terms, yes, I could talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and the ways in which we need to construct inclusivity infrastructures. For others, I'm a pedagogical theorist in terms of coming in the tradition of talking about culturally relevant and culturally sustaining pedagogy, really uplifting some of the theorists that have been doing this work for a mighty long time. But as I started to ponder in terms of the work that I really do, here's a term that might be a little scary to some of you, but I'm going to provide context. I'm one that comes in the Black prophetic tradition, right? At the core of the work that I do, I'm one that comes in the Black prophetic tradition. And you may say, okay, so does that mean that you have nothing to say to me? Or, perhaps because you come in the Black prophetic tradition and I don't identify as being Black, should I listen to what you have to say? And what I would argue is that those that have come in the Black prophetic tradition have been on the forefront of bearing truth to America and to the globe. So we could talk about individuals such as W.E.B. Du Bois. We could talk about individuals such as Malcolm X, who I would argue, right, when we look at self-regulated learning, I believe that Malcolm X picture should come up. We could talk about Ella Baker. We could talk about Ida B. Wells. We could talk about a young man that not too many people talk about as we talk about the radical tradition. That's Fred Hampton, perhaps because he was murdered at the age of 21. There's another, and I know that this could cause a little bit of conflict, but I want to suggest that at his best, and the person that I believe that he was continuing to evolve into, Tupac Shakur was coming in that tradition. But at the core to me, in terms of if I was to say that person that most aligns with my work is Dr. King. So in many ways, yes, you're going to get a HELP framework, but then you're also going to get my social justice lens where I'm going to uplift Dr. King in terms of how it's intersected with my work and hopefully how it intersects with your work. But let me provide a working definition if we were to talk about the Black prophetic tradition. Cornel West says this: the Black prophetic tradition is simply one that says, in the face of white supremacy, which we know still exists, in the face of Jim and Jane Crow laws that we know still exists, is just masqueraded as, policy A or policy B. We got to analytically understand it, meaning there's a lot of analyzing that we have to do today. We have to prophetically bear witness, meaning we have to be truth tellers and we have to have the courage to speak truth. And we got to generate forms of fight back that organize and mobilize. So what I'm hoping is that at the end of today's conversation, you will understand the need to be analytical within your work, to be truthful within your work, but not only that, to lead with some strategies in terms of what you need to do within your own context. So I would like to argue that today's conversation is rated M, meaning this is a mature conversation because we can no longer masquerade the funk. This past year, and I'm gonna go deeper in a second with this point, there's been a whole lot of funk that we can no longer masquerade in the United States. But not only that, this funk has intersected into our schools, our classrooms, and our school districts for too long. And quite frankly, the students, the families, and the communities that we are serving, they're clapping back and they're saying, no more funk. They have to hold us accountable. So this will be a mature conversation. So as much as I said that I'm honored to be here, this is a tremendous responsibility. For those of us that do this work, we realize that over the past year, and specifically since the end of May, our work has intensified. We have been doing it around the clock. We have not had time to refresh ourselves because the demand is so high to have these conversations. And not only is the demand high for us to have these conversations, but we have to be courageous enough to really speak truthfully because of what we've been dealing with. So as much as I'm saying it is a mature conversation, I also would like to argue that if you need to step away for a few minutes, please do so. One of the things that have been really cognizant about these past few months is to center my own self-care. In the midst of getting phone calls, text messages, and emails, I realized I'm not going to be good for anyone if I don't center my own self-care. So if there's a moment where it's a little bit too hot and too heavy, or maybe something that I said or an image that you are seeing, if it triggers some things, if you have to step away, I totally understand it. Take care of yourself, and hopefully you're able to come back to engage in the conversation. So let me offer a few disclosures. As mentioned, in many ways, this conversation that we are about to engage in is the backdrop to this book that's coming out and this work that I have presented in various ways over the last few years. So in many ways, for some of you, you may think that this is an existential conversation. For others, you may say, well, because, he's a professor, he's an academic, he's an Ivy, the metaphoric, ivory tower, and he's just making these claims. So for some of you, you may think it's philosophical. For others, you may think that it's theoretical. But I want to argue that everything that I'm talking about today, the existential, the philosophical, the theoretical, is directly linked to this conversation around equity in education. And how do we get better at getting better? But then it's also about not just having a talk about racism. It's really coming from the perspective of how do we end racism? How do we, go deeper with issues related to race and racism so that they can stop recapitulating themselves in various forms? So, another disclosure. At times, I'm going to be coming from the perspective of the teacher in terms of some of the things that you could do in the classroom. At other times, from the teacher educator, for those of you that are in higher education, right? And you're working with teacher candidates, the things that you can do, or maybe you're working with principal candidates, right? At other times, I'm coming from the perspective of the educational leader or the organizational leader in terms of ways that you need to think a little bit more strategic around your DE&I goals, around your hiring practices. At other times, I'm going to come from the perspective of the mental health clinician, really causing us to wrestle with the psychological aspects of everything that we are going to talk about. And why is that important? I think it's important that I'm coming from multiple lanes because at the core, I want us to find a connection. Oftentimes when we have these conversations, we're coming from the perspective of what separates us. But I believe that you are here this morning because you're really saying every student matters. I hope that's why we're here this morning. That you believe that 100% of the students that you serve in your school district, your communities, that they have value, that they have gifts, that they have tremendous purpose. And our goal is to co-partner with our students and our communities to make sure that we're doing everything that we can do for them to reach their potential, not coming from a savior perspective, not coming from a top-down perspective, but coming from the perspective of understanding that we are called to be in fellowship with our students and our communities. So as we think about that, there are a few things that you're going to hear this morning. Number one, we're about to get into what I am really arguing that we need to really have these conversations within these times, and this is social justice. Too many of us are talking about social justice, but we're talking about social justice like we talk about the soup of the day. We're talking about, social justice is important, but we're not defining what we mean by that. Not only are we not defining what social justice means for us, but we have no clear ideal in terms of how do we operationalize social justice. So it just becomes this trite conversation. So in just a minute, I'm going to go deeper with what I mean by social justice. And I'm going to give it some other language. But then also, I'm going to talk about this H.E.L.P framework. This H.E.L.P framework in many ways that I coined and that I developed and that I'm this mad scientist with. Because what I'm arguing is that oftentimes we want to begin at step 4, but we have no clue about steps 1, 2, and 3. And we don't have any clue about the root issues that make step 4 necessary. So I'm going to walk us through this framework. But going back to social justice, what I'm arguing, and this is in alignment with colleagues at the University of Texas, is that we need to reframe this conversation with social justice to really talking about radical social justice. What does radical social justice mean? So, according to Dantley and Green, they claim that social justice needs to be more radical and also prophetic. What they're saying is that oftentimes we think just having a conversation around equity or anti-racist practices is social justice. And what they're saying is that that's not even in the conversation of social justice. Social justice means that now, after the conversation, we are willing to do whatever we have to do to make sure that we reverse whatever inequitable issues may exist. So my colleagues and I, we recently published an article titled "Lessons Learned in the Pursuit of Social Justice in Education." And we looked at some of the projects that we were doing across the country, and we explored our projects through the lens of social justice. And this work is published in a handbook on promoting social justice and education. But for myself personally, if I was to really talk about social justice, I have to come in the tradition of Dr. King. And not this Dr. King that many of us were going to uplift on next Monday with a snippet of a speech, but I'm talking about the radical King, the radical king that many of us, we don't even think exists, the radical king that you're going to learn about today if you're not familiar with that radical king. And for others, we're going to go deeper in our understanding of the radical king. So for example, because of our own agenda, we reduce, we sanitize, and whitewash Dr. King to just being the dreamer, while overlooking the totality of his words on August the 28th, 1963. We overlook the majority of what he argued on August the 28th, 1963, in the so-called I Have a Dream speech. Why am I saying the so-called I Have a Dream speech? Because Jesse Jackson would argue he was not talking about a dream that day. He was talking about broken promises within our democracy, right? If you listen to the speech, so many people, they just get to the last 7 minutes, but we forget what he was arguing for the majority of the speech. So what I want to really uplift today is the radical Dr. King, and not the Dr. King in which we take a snippet of a speech and we say this is who he was because of the myth of colorblindness, right? Because we want to act as if we are a post-racial society. We want to act as if some of the things that we've seen these last 12 months, those were just the rotten apples, right? And what my colleague, Dr. Sonia Douglas Horsford, would argue in her, I'm going to call it a classic book, Learning in a Burning House, is that when we give into the myth of colorblindness, we normalize whiteness while constructing people of color as being others. Audre Lorde would suggest that when we give into the myth of colorblindness, we refuse to recognize the different makes it impossible to see the different problems and pitfalls that face us. So today, as the intro, we got to talk about the radical king. We have to talk about this radical king that had a whole lot to say. This radical king that challenged us throughout his life, but I want to situate it to February the 4th, 1968. Just 2 months before he was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. And I want to take us back to a sermon that he gave at the Ebenezer Baptist Church. And it's titled The Drum Major Instinct. And I want to take snippets of this sermon and intersect it into what we're seeing today. So he says this, he names a whole lot of problems in terms of those of us that have the drum major instinct. What he argues, number one, when we have the drum major instinct, he's suggesting that we're coming from the perspective of pride, of wanting to be important, to surpass others, to achieve distinction, to lead the parade. Meaning, because of our own ego, we want to be out front. We want to put on our websites how committed we are to equity. We want to put on our websites how good we are and how diversity is valued. We want to say that we're here and perhaps another school is here, right? Because of our own ego. But then another aspect of the drum major instinct that he argues will become destructive. He says this, I want to move to the point of saying that if this instinct, this drum major instinct is not harnessed, it becomes a very dangerous and pernicious instinct, meaning it's evil. For instance, if it isn't harnessed, it causes one personality to become distorted. So I take us back to, as our Secretary of Education did earlier in his remarks to last week, just 1 week ago, the events in Washington, D.C. And following the events, a lot of people were in denial. And this is what Kendi writes, denial is the heartbeat of America. When have Americans been willing to admit who we really are? we want to say, well, those were just the bad apples, or perhaps within our schools, that's just one teacher. We got rid of that teacher. Or perhaps we're saying, well, you know what? That was just one student group that made those comments. And I would like to push us to what Dr. Eddie Glaude lifted to the nation in August of 2019, that this is us. Perhaps this is who we really are. What he suggests is that America is not unique in its sins as a country. We're not unique in our evils, to be honest with you. So one of the things that we have to really be courageous enough to do today is to be honest. That perhaps these last 12 months were not just the rotten apples. Perhaps these issues and these things that we continue to see are rooted within systems. Perhaps for many of us, we have been socialized in these ideologies because maybe this is us. But then I take us back to Dr. King a few years earlier, before he talked about the drum major instinct. I take us back to Birmingham and his letter from a Birmingham jail. And people were saying, why are you coming in? We don't have issues here in Birmingham. What people were saying is that these are just these outside agitators that are coming in to stir up these troubles or these problems within our communities. Perhaps that's the narrative of many of you today. Perhaps in your own school, you're trying to push your colleagues to get into book conversations and to have discussions. And people are saying, we don't really have those issues. That's just a teacher that's trying to put these things out here. This teacher that's doing these things because of their own propaganda. And Dr. King, he says this: number one, normally I don't even have time to engage in these conversations because I'm just too busy, right? But he says this: I'm here in Birmingham because injustice is here. The reason that we're here this morning, again, it has nothing to do with Dr. Ronald W. Whittaker II. It has nothing to do with Noe Ortega. It has everything to do with the fact that injustice exists in society and within our schools, our school districts, and our classrooms. And because of that, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. As Dr. King says, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects us all indirectly. I don't care what side you're on. This is not a political conversation today, by the way. This is not Democrat, Republican, Independent. It's not red state or blue state. But if you haven't been impacted by some of the things that we have witnessed explicitly over the last 12 months, but I would argue that always existed and always plays itself out, then something is wrong, right? So we have to stop being in denial. Colleagues recently published a book, Unconscious Biases in Schools. And what they're arguing in this text is that it's time now for teachers and educational leaders to deal with these unconscious biases. Because we keep talking about professional developments, we keep talking about book studies, we keep talking about policy changes, but one of the things that remains the same is that minoritized students and vulnerable students, we continue to see these ugly attacks. And until we stop being in denial, we're never going to reach our equity goals. But then, as I go back to February the 4th, 1968, Dr. King, he's laying down this vicious argument, right? It's a classic if you're not familiar, by the way. And then he says, another problem with the drum major instinct is that when we operate from the arrogant perspective and the prideful perspective of the drum major instinct, it leads to this snobbish exclusivism. In terms of we are being snobbish and exclusive in terms of who we hang with and who we associate with. And I said, wow, that's just like many of us in educational spaces that even claim to be on the front lines of equity. We're on the front lines of equity, but we're coming at it from the standpoint of being snobbish and exclusive in terms of who's invited in to do the work. And even that language. Why do we have to invite folk in where in many ways the students in the communities that we are serving are in fellowship with, they are the experts. But we're snobbish and exclusive. So we're saying that we want to deal with equity and anti-racist. We want to go deeper with anti-racist practices. We want to develop strategic plans, but at the same time, we have this exclusive mindset in terms of who we will listen to. And really, it's because for many of us, we have a savior mentality, right? And let me just say this, because I want to be very courageous with this conversation, because that's where we are. Sometimes we're talking about a white savior complex, and obviously that's true. But I also want to argue that when we talk about a savior complex and how that ties to white supremacy can also operate in Black and brown bodies. So I want us also to be very clear with that. But then another thing about being snobbish, and something that has really frustrated many of us that do the work, there's so many people in companies that have tried to monopolize this moment because there's a lot of money to be made in suffering. So some folk will say, I'm all in it because Black lives matter. I'm all in it because I'm committed to equity. I'm all in it because I'm committed to dismantling systems of oppression. But it's a way to make money. It's a way to capitalize off of the suffering. A few weeks ago, colleagues and I, we wrote an op-ed article, and what I really suggested is that this is nothing more than DEI in blackface. That we're masquerading, that we're really committed to this work, but it's because we want to profit off of the work, because we want to profit off of the suffering. That leads to now me jumping into the H.E.L.P framework. And I want to deal with the first two components before we take a break. But prior to doing that, I want to give us an overview of this H.E.L.P framework. And I'm not suggesting that the H.E.L.P framework is the answer. What I'm suggesting, though, is that the H.E.L.P framework has caused me to go a lot deeper into the ways in which I am facilitating my practice. And I'm also not suggesting that the H.E.L.P framework is coming from a top-down or savior approach, which I'm about to explain. But when we're talking about the H.E.L.P framework, this is what I mean by it. In my role as a professor and equity center director, like many of you that's on the Zoom today, you get numerous requests, whether that's a phone call, email, text message from colleagues. Many of them are teachers, or some are board members, or some are educational leaders. But for myself, normally, folk are reaching out for help. Maybe it's from the perspective of helping teachers to better understand the changing demographics in their school or the changing demographics in their school district. And I think for many of us, we know that that's code language, oftentimes for Black and brown students. Other times, there's a request for help with constructing an equity plan, right? A school or school district, they're saying that they want to move forward and they need help with moving forward with how to design or construct an equity plan. For some, maybe it's help. You know, could you talk to our teachers and administrators about the so-called academic achievement gap? And that's the language that they use. But for many of us, we know we align with, it's not an academic achievement gap, it's an opportunity gap, right? But then later on, once I get to the L component, I want to push us even with that language. So here's what I said, and I want to disclose. In a manner to courageously deal with the complex residue issues that still exist within society and educational spaces, I found it necessary. I said I can no longer do these professional developments that in many ways I felt were trite, in many ways I felt was inauthentic. So I'm going home. This is obviously pre-COVID. Now I'm doing it virtually, but I'm driving home and I would have this dissonance within me in terms of what I just offered to teachers and educators. Was it really getting to the core of what I was really trying to say? So I found it necessary to develop an acronym and framework for the word HELP that would push teachers and educational leaders to think more deeply about issues of race and racism, institutional structures of inequity, and deficit mindsets that might, but probably exist within their contexts. So when we're looking at this HELP framework, I have to start with the H, because oftentimes we want to get to the P, we want to get to the practical, right? How do we learn about culturally relevant pedagogy, or perhaps you want to call it culturally sustaining pedagogy, or reality pedagogy, or culturally proficient, or culturally responsive? We want to get to the P. We want to get to programming, right? How do we, design a program? How do we design a book club? Many of us want to get to the P, but we don't want to deal with the H. And what I'm suggesting, the H is the history of racism and racist acts in educational spaces and society. What makes it, and what I'm suggesting is that the H is at the core of why the P even exists. But then we get to the E, and we have to analyze the difference between equality and equity, because there is a profound difference. The L argues that love is an essential element to students' sense of belonging. I'm not just coming from a philosophical standpoint. I'm really want to go deeper with that claim. And then we get to the P, the practical, right? So what I'm suggesting is that this framework is interdisciplinary, because the issues that we are dealing with in educational spaces are multifaceted, right? So in many ways, this work is influenced from various perspectives. A legal perspective. In a minute, we're going to talk about critical race theory, right? And at its core, critical race theory is rooted in legal studies. Everything that we're now hearing as a result of last week, guess what? We're talking about law. When we're talking about COVID-19 and educational inequities because of COVID-19, and when we're talking about how, especially vulnerable students have been impacted in the season, I want to suggest it is a public health perspective. When we're talking about, if we don't get this situation right, this moment right that we are dealing with, what are the business implications, right? For individuals in terms of their potential earnings, if we continue to operate as business as usual. I wish we had time for a mental health conversation, because I think we all can suggest that over this last year, all of us have been triggered. And when we come out of this moment that we're in, I'm also going to suggest many of us need to make sure that we have regular appointments with therapists because of this moment that we're in. But too often we overlook the mental health stressors, and we continue to tell our students to show more grit, or to go a little bit deeper. And our students, quite frankly, they have been doing that. For some of us that have faith affiliations, some of us see the theological implications of this moment. As mentioned, I'm lifting up Dr. King today, and for many of us, we totally overlooked the fact that he was a Black Baptist preacher. We just look at him as he gave a speech. but he was also coming from a theological perspective. There was a theological lens that guided everything that he said. So when we talk about the H.E.L.P framework, in many ways, the H, the E, and the L is going to deal with the conditions that we are grappling with in society, in our nation, but also within our schools, classrooms, and school districts. And then the P is the practical. And I want to call that the prescription. And again, not as if I am the end all be all. That's not the case. I'm just offering you one perspective in terms of the ways in which perhaps you could do some things differently within your context. So let's get to the H. And by the H, I'm really talking about the history of racism and other isms and phobias that exist within society and educational spaces. We could call this the elephant in the classroom, the elephant in schools, the elephant in school districts, the elephant on campus, the elephant within our organizations. Let me also say this. So within my work, I also acknowledge and I deal with and I partner with colleagues around issues related to making sure that ableism, homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, and sexism is also dismantled. I want to put that out there. But what I'm talking about today, and primarily within my professional practice, primarily centers around issues related to race, since racism is still that illegitimate child in classrooms and schools that not too many teachers and administrators want to claim. We don't want to talk about it. And even for some of us to say that we want to talk about it, we use other language without directly confronting racism and white supremacy. We can't use that language. There have been times that schools and districts have reached out to me and they said, well, can't we frame it a little bit differently? Because we don't want to deal with it. So many times I've been on consultations for an hour or so talking to district leaders. And after an hour, they said, well, what if we don't, get buy-in with that? And what I've started to say is that, in many ways, you wasted my time because you still want to skirt around the issue. So the claim that I'm making as we jump into the H is that the last 12 months in the United States are not isolated incidents, but rather racism is ingrained in US system. Racism is ingrained not just in US systems, but in systems. We see this with these COVID-19 educational disparities. It really just illuminates everything that many of us know already exists. We started last year, in terms of dealing with Ahmaud Arbery. Then we get to Breonna Taylor, right? Then we get to Amy Cooper, that many of us forget about that incident, but I have to tag her back into the conversation, particularly once we get to the L. We all know about Memorial Day with George Floyd. And then particularly over these last couple months, we've seen at its highest level this dissonance and this divide in our country because of political affiliations and ideologies. But what I would like to say also, again, as I push us, these events from the last year are situated within a larger narrative. Let's not be in denial anymore. What I would like to suggest is that it goes back to the enslavement of individuals of African descent. We're really talking about the Black codes. We're really talking about Jim and Jane Crow laws that we still know exist. We're really talking about this pernicious and deadly prison industrial complex. So everything that has been uplifted and that many of us, we've been on conference, we attended conferences around these issues. It's situated in a larger narrative that too many of us forget, and for others, we don't even know that it ever existed. So as I talk about the need for therapy, in many ways, the late, great Gil Scott-Heron in this season has been my therapist, because I also believe that he was a truth teller. And in 1974, he sings that it is winter in America. And he says that all of our healers have been killed or sent away. That's why we're here today. We're here because we need to heal, but we're also here because we know that healing needs to exist within our educational spaces. But in order for us to do that, we have to go deeper. I show this image only because Mammy Till Mobley decided to show this image to the nation in 1955. Her beautiful son, Emmett Till, 14 years old, he's brutally murdered in Money, Mississippi. Mama Mobley, she sees her baby and she's heartbroken. Everyone is saying, you need to have a closed casket because after he got shot, his eyes were picked out. He was set on fire. He was thrown in the river down there in Mississippi. There's no way that you can have an open casket. And Emmett's mother says, no, the world needs to see what violence and racism looks like, because we can no longer be in denial. But on her words that she lifts up, September the 3rd, 1955, she offers comfort even in her grief by saying this: I don't have a minute to hate. I'm going to pursue justice for the rest of my life. So everything that we're talking about this morning or throughout the day, this is not about hatred, Black versus white, gay versus straight, Democrat versus Republican, urban versus suburban, charter versus public education. It's about justice. And are we committed to justice? But then I lift up Emmett Till and intersect that with George Floyd. And let me say this, in no ways am I overlooking some of the others who have been murdered, as we would call our Black Lives Matter martyrs. I'm not overlooking Trayvon or Eric Gardner, Sandra Bland, Rekia Boyd. I'm not overlooking these individuals. But for many individuals around the globe, something happened this past Memorial Day. At first, we were saying 8 minutes, 44 seconds. Other reports now say perhaps it was 7 minutes, regardless of the time. What the nation saw for 7 to 8 minutes, or for some 7 to 9 minutes, they saw a man that was not a threat. They saw an individual yelling out, "I can't breathe." They saw an individual that urinated on himself, an individual that was calling out for his mother. And the nation saw him take his last breath. And I'm tying it back to this Emmett Till moment, as others have tied it back, because once again, this nation has been forced to look at what I would argue the ROI of its original sin of racism. That we cannot no longer say it does not exist. Because after George Floyd, as we all know, what happened after the protests is that within many of our schools and school districts now, our students were saying this exists. Teachers, educational leaders, this district, the knee has been on my neck, I can't breathe. Students at the collegiate level, they're saying the same thing. Professionals, they're saying the same thing. Athletes have been saying the same thing, that the system is suffocating us. And what Michael Eric Dyson writes in his new book, and if you don't have it, I would argue you need to get it, long time coming, is that Floyd's death revealed the pervasive rot at the core of a system that never treated Black folk or vulnerable folk with respect. That's what we're dealing with when we're really talking about going deeper with issues related to race and racism. We have to get to the core issues. Du Bois would argue, and Du Bois needs to be reading for every student, right? He argues that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Well, we're now in the 21st century, and we still have a problem of the color line. And this is why it's important for all of us that's on Zoom today, because history will speak to what we have decided to do in this moment, if this is going to continue to be the issue in the 22nd century. Or will we be courageous enough in this moment to say we have to change? And if we're going to be courageous enough, let's also intersect Dr. Cornel West into the conversation when he's talking about race matters. Here's a synopsis. What he's really arguing is that racism is still pernicious. It's still, evil, that COVID has forced us to really get into conversations that, we have a digital divide. Did you know what? We have to be innovative. You know what? We have to be flexible. That's evil. The pandemic has forced us to have that conversation when we knew it existed. It's pervasive, meaning it is widespread. It is perplexing. For many of you that are saying, I'm on the front lines and I want to make change, some of you are so frustrated and tired in this moment because of all the layers and the systems that you have to get through just to get some sort of a proposal passed to go before the board because of these systems. And why is that the case? Because we know that, unfortunately, all of this conversation that we're having today is tied to power. Who has the power? But unfortunately, it's problematic because it has real life implications. I'm coming in a perspective of the fierce urgency of now. This is about, if we don't make changes, we're going to see the destruction of students and communities. That's problematic. So what I would like to also say is that in this moment, as much as I'm saying we're all overworked and we all have been stressed, we all have been dealing with some issues, I want to put a charge out there that as we're having these conversations, these book discussions and these book talks and these professional developments and consultants such as myself coming in, can I put it out there? Can I put a charge out there that we can no longer go back to this once this pandemic is over? When we're now in the classroom, 100%, that we're still seeing disproportionate data as it relates to discipline. Disproportionate data as it relates to who is placed into special education, when we're seeing profound gaps in terms of who has access to AP courses, when we're still having issues in terms of tracking, and then we're still dealing with teacher mindsets and beliefs, that we have no way to assess our teachers in terms of how comfortable they are with having a conversation. When we're hiring candidates, is that a part of the questions that we're putting out there in terms of equity and the comfortability with equity and incorporating other aspects into the curriculum? We can no longer go back to this moment. We can no longer go back to this data in terms of the expulsion rates and students who are arrested, and the fact that Black students are 3.5 times more likely to be suspended than white students. We can no longer go back to this moment. But not only that, it's time for all of us. And once we get to the P, I'm going to talk a little bit about intake, right? And what we need to do. But we also realize this is just not a conversation for teachers. In many ways, we're putting all of the pressure on teachers, and I know that that's important. I'm a teacher educator. I know the ways in which we're trying to train our teachers, but at the same time, we overlook the role of educational leaders and the role of our board members. That, you know what, if our teachers are having a conversation, that also means that our board needs to have the conversation. If we're really having conversation around ways that we need to diversify the teaching profession, can we also look at the demographics in terms of who's on our boards? Right? And this was released a few months ago that 90% of school superintendents said conversations about race and equity are either extremely or very important, but only 21% said that they were prepared to have those conversations. I'm sorry, that's problematic. So we also need to think about the ways in which we are holding our educational leaders accountable. So we look at, well, what can we do? One of the things as a starter, and I'm gonna go a little bit deeper once we get to the P aspect, is that racial literacy is important. One of my mentors, Dr. Howard Stevenson at the University of Pennsylvania, what he's talking about in his work is that racial literacy is the ability to read and recast or reduce and resolve racially stressful encounters. What he says is that for many of us, we're saying, well, Dr. Whittaker, I'm here this morning because I want to have the conversation. I'm here this morning because I want to be on the front lines of change. But for many of us, we lack the skills because we're anxious or we're overwhelmed or we're tongue-tied because we have all of these emotions that have been, that is in us, right? That once it's time to have the conversations, we're not even comfortable enough, or we're so anxious that it's not coming out. So racial literacy is very important. So what else can we do? And this comes from the work of Dr. Howard, a professor at UCLA. And this comes on the backdrop of Charlottesville and what we saw in 2017. Number one, he puts it out there again that teachers, educational leaders, we have to equip ourselves with the sound knowledge on the history of slavery, racism, xenophobia, and the constant quest for equity. So he says sound knowledge, that it goes beyond what we're seeing on Twitter. It goes beyond Fox News or MSNBC, that we actually have to read, right? We have to get into the works of scholars, and we have to humble ourselves. But then again, not just coming from the savior complex or this exclusive complex in terms of who can teach us, but it also means that perhaps we need to shut up and listen to our students. We need to be quiet and listen to our community elders because they're the experts. But then here's the other piece, and I'm pushing us to be honest, because this has really emerged in my own work over the last few months. Educators have to prepare for the fact that these conversations and lessons will be uncomfortable and they do not always end smoothly. I'm dealing with so many leaders right now where they are torn. They're saying, we got the letter from students, we got the letter from this particular group. And we're saying we want to do better, but at the same time, people are saying that they're not seeing enough momentum. I've gotten so many emails or phone calls around that issue. And what I would like to suggest is that because now, right, we're dealing in, again, this moment where we can no longer deny this moment in terms of everything that many people have been saying forever. It is directly in folks' face, is opened up. Folk are saying, no, I know that you want to get past this moment, but we don't. And we're going to stay here, and we have to own that. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a second when I transition to the E, but we also can't rush this moment. I know we want to get to the other side. I know we want to move forward with the goals that we have outlined in our strategic plans, right? But we also have to understand, perhaps for some people, they're saying, no, we need to stay here and we're going to hold you accountable until we see those things fully operationalized that we put in paper. And that's also an important part of being humble and showing that we're really committed to this work, by the way. So what else can we do? Before I transition to the E, number one, again, I'm pushing us, no longer deny it. We have to name it. If we cannot name it, there's no way that we can frame interventions. So we have to name it. If it's deficit mindsets that you're seeing within your context, name it. If it's racist policies that still exist, name it. If we're seeing that white supremacy is still operationalized within our districts, we have to name it. We have to be courageous enough to name it. But then also, we have to start with ourselves and simply begin. Can I go back to Dr. King again, a radical Dr. King? We go back to 1968, and as history and those that were closest to him, what they would suggest is that if he was living today, some doctors would say that, you know what? He would be clinically depressed. Why is that? Perhaps he would be clinically depressed because people were saying, white America was saying, we don't want to hear this guy. But not only white America, Black America was saying, we're tired of hearing him too. This nonviolence thing is played out. We don't want to hear it. Then he starts talking about the war in Vietnam. And then he's talking about, economic justice, and he's trying to organize the Poor People's Campaign. And people are saying, we are tired of listening to him. And Dr. King, even in his depression, even in his grief, even in his weakness, he's still saying, if I'm the last man standing, so what? So many of us were waiting for this collective moment. We're waiting for this moment where all of our colleagues will suddenly become woke, or we're waiting for this moment where our district, they're suddenly going to get it. And I'm going to say this, if we're waiting for that moment, we're going to continue to be in this moment. So you have to start with yourself and simply begin. Whatever level you're on, if you're at a level 1, jump on in. If you're at a level 5, that's fine. Continue to go deeper. Even for those of us that think that we're a little bit more advanced, what I would like to suggest is that, believe me, if you're really committed to this work and if you're really doing this work, you're also going to grapple with some of the claims that you put out there. But then, how about this? We have to get over our own fragility and guess what? Just focus on our students. It's about our students because every student matters. Let me rush. I'm looking at the time and I realize that I'm really starting to get to that lecture point. So let me get through the E and then let's take a break, right? So what I want to do is pose a question that I want you to grapple with, and perhaps, we could get into a conversation once we get to the Q&A, but, if not, perhaps you could take this back with your team members. When we look at, does your school or school district have a plan for addressing issues of racial inequity? So I want to know, does your school or school district have a plan for addressing issues of racial inequities? So when we look at this moment, talking about the E, the second component, the difference between equity and equality, right? And this is me now shifting, as mentioned, I'm going to shift lanes a little bit. This is now me as the DEI strategist and learning from those that are what I would call gurus in this field. And what Dr. Damon Williams would suggest is that too many diversity planning efforts are reactive, isolated, simplistic, and driven by crisis or these cheetah moments, right? What he suggests is that something embarrassing happens in our schools, school districts, our campus. And as a result of this embarrassing incident, we're saying we need to do something. So normally what we do is we form a committee and we develop some goals and we write a report and we put it out there, right? And he's saying, in many ways, this is nothing more than symbolism, right? This is symbolic. Because what he would suggest and what other reports would suggest or research would suggest around DEI plans is that a lot of the attention is around mobilizing and developing a plan, but in terms of operationalizing that plan, at best, is mediocre. But let me go a little bit deeper again with what I would call some truth tellers, right? Some prophetic truth tellers. Going back to Gil Scott-Heron, he would suggest it's nothing more than symbols of democracy. That is nothing more than these symbols. The late great Derek Bell, in his classic book, Faces at the Bottom of the Well, what he would suggest is that oftentimes these are symbols that keep us pacified. We're saying we're putting it out there to our community. See, we didn't overlook it. Now we have a plan, and we're going to put it on the website, and we're going to have, some sort of an event to say that we're going to move forward. And he's saying, again, this is nothing more than symbolism. So I want to caution everyone. This is me coming from the DEI strategist standpoint, that is as excited as you are about forming your committee and writing the plan and putting it on the website in terms of equity plan 2025 or equity plan 2027 or whatever, however you want to frame it. Let's just make sure it's nothing that is not symbolism, that is actually rooted, that there's also some accountability measures that are in place, because if not, there's nothing more, it's nothing more than symbols of democracy. Let me go back to the point I raised in terms of the difference, in terms of where we are in this moment. That I know many of us, we want to move forward, and we're saying, hey, we're trying to be in conversation with our students and our community leaders, but it's getting a little bit contentious. Some of you are saying, well, what about the beloved community? I want us to, I want to form the beloved community. That's what I'm about. But we overlook the fact of the other king, the radical king that I'm uplifting today. This king that James Cone does a brilliant job of lifting up in his classic book, Martin and Malcolm in America, Dream or Nightmare. He talks about that towards the end of their life, how Martin and Malcolm was becoming essentially the same person. We forget about this radical king that talks about, that 2 weeks later, after I gave the I Have a Dream speech, my dream turned into a nightmare. When those precious young girls were murdered on a Sunday morning at church. So again, we have to move beyond embarrassment to true equity. And if we're going to move towards true equity, that means that we have to stay and wrestle with some things. I'm not going to take too much time here, because many of us are familiar with this in terms of the difference between equality and equity. But I want to embellish this image a little bit and talk about, for many of us, we're talking a whole lot of equity language, right? But at best, what I'm suggesting is that all we're doing is recapitulating equality mindsets. But if we're really going to get to the next level, we have to be committed to what I'm calling liberation and freedom for all of our students. Milner, he argues that equity in education means that we are committed to providing students with what they need to succeed. But I want to put it on, and I think I could do this with Dr. Milner, because we're colleagues and friends, not only to succeed, but also to be free. But then, if I want to go deeper, if we're going to be committed to equity, and as much as my work really centers around issues of race and racism and ways that we have to support Black boys and males, can we also hashtag say her name and talk about the experiences of Black and brown girls? Can we also talk about the experiences of our queer students? Can we also talk about how ableism exists within our schools? So again, I'm coming from one perspective, but if we're looking at equity, equity is very broad. And we need to make sure that we are meeting the needs of all of our students, regardless of how they identify, because now I'm putting Kimberly Crenshaw into this conversation, another lens to explore this work. We understand that intersectionality is very important, meaning how we identify, or the various ways in which we identify that we're dealing with multiple forms of oppression, or multiple layers of oppression. If we're going to be committed to equity, and not too far from Cabrini University is Philadelphia, and we also had one of those cases that happened over this past year, didn't quite get the national attention, and I believe because it was framed around, well, Walter Wallace Jr. had a knife in his hand, and he had some mental health challenges, and he had all of these other things. And here's what I would like to say. In no ways am I saying that any of us would not feel threatened if someone came to us with a knife, but mental health challenges should not be synonymous with the morgue. It goes back to our training, the training of those that are police officers, but also our students. That no longer, again, can we go back to business as usual and say that this student was acting out in class or now online, and we are demonizing them and we are killing them because perhaps we don't have the skills in terms of how to engage them. So my colleague, Dr. Nicole Hollis-Sims, many of you are familiar with this. You may say, well, again, how do I go deeper with issues of equity? I would argue, well, if you go to the Pennsylvania Department of Education, there's an equity hub. There's a lot of tremendous information out there. What else can we do? We're talking about equity, and many of you are going through the reopening phases. There's some questions that perhaps you need to ask yourself, right? Are your colleagues that you need to really wrestle and ponder with these questions? For example, does your plan bridge the digital divide for students once we come back into schools? And I know I'm rushing, I'm going to share this PowerPoint, but I want to make sure that we get a break. What else can we do? We need to think about what Gorski offers in his commandments. Not going to go through all of them, but can I lift up number 10? And I think that number 10 is so important, that we're saying, I will prioritize equity over peace. It takes us back to this moment, moving beyond embarrassment to true equity. This is not a sprint, and we have to develop our endurance. So for many of us, we need to understand that if you're really going to be committed to equity authentically and through a radical approach, that peace may not exist for a little while because we're that committed to equity. That's the real work. What else can we do? Dr. Patina Love, I love this. You know, that she's arguing, forget about the whole ally conversation. We need co-conspirators, right? A co-conspirator functions as a verb, not as a noun, meaning you have to do something. For example, as males, what she's arguing is that we need to understand our privilege, and then we have to work to challenge and undo patriarchy. She's saying there's so much conversation around allies. Forget that. We need co-conspirators in this season. What else can we do? And this is lifted from an article that I published a few years ago, but we have to avoid these educational sins that lower expectations for students, and even in this age of being virtual, right? That we're quote unquote dumbing it down. It's not about that. It's about high expectations. It's about us being innovative to make sure that we're reaching all the students. We have to stop. Well, our students aren't logging on and we're not getting enough participation. They just don't care about their education. Again, that's a deficit mindset. So therefore, we are engaging them from a deficit perspective. How we define students correlates with how we engage students. And at the core, we have to stop problematizing students instead of dealing with the problems of practice that exist within education and society. So I'm going to lift up this question, and then we will take a break. What is your school or your district's measurable goals around equity? I want you to think about that. And perhaps if you haven't had this conversation, this is something that you could take back to your colleagues. So what is your school or your district's measurable goals around equity? So with that being said, perhaps now is a good spot. Dr. Nicole Hollis-Sims, it's in your hands, perhaps 10 to 15 minutes as we're getting to the end point.
Dr. Whittaker, I just have to say, I just shared with my husband, you're killing it. And I'm saying that to say that you're connecting and you're making a lot of great points that people needed to hear today. So I just want to, again, thank you for that. We are at 10:45. I would hope that if you're okay, and Dr. Whittaker, I'm going to look to you if you're okay with them coming back at 11.
Absolutely.
Okay. So folks, if you want to take about a 15-minute break to just kind of stretch and just rejuvenate yourself, we'll see you back here. Please continue to keep the questions coming in the Q&A. Dr. Whittaker, just so you know, we have a few. So by the time you're done, we may have some time at the end to pose them to you, but awesome. We do have a lot, and that's great. So we'll see you back at 11.
Thank you.
Dr. Whittaker, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I'm back on. And Dr. Sims, I have to say this. I think it's a good conversation. And I could always tell it's a good conversation when someone sends me a direct private message cussing at me. So at least it was not done in a public space, but I say that with, joking, but also just being honest that I think we're hitting some things. The first time that I published an op-ed, I received so many trolls that I literally was stressed for a week until I realized that that's the result. So at least this time I only had one direct message, when someone called me GDB and some other things, but I'm not going to put you on blast. We're just going to continue. So with that being said, let's just get to the L as it gets, as it pertains to the L. So we dealt with the H and the E, and I'm about to get to the prescription, but the L still deals with our condition, right? And as we talk about the L, we have to seriously wrestle with the prophetic question raised by Tina Turner when she asked, what's love got to do with it, right? And I know that may sound a little bit corny, to some people. For others, perhaps you're saying, we know perhaps how old he is, and this is a sneak peek in terms of what my mother was listening to. But engaging in this conversation, what I want to suggest is not just from a philosophical standpoint. Love is important because too many of our students are treated as nobodies. Takes us back to Ferguson, Missouri, and this is language that I'm very intentional with using because Dr. Mark Lamont Hill, he writes this phenomenal book, Nobody, Casualties of America's War on the Vulnerable from Ferguson to Flint and Beyond. The title is very intentional by Dr. Hill. So Dr. Hill and so many others, they're really grieving in terms of how is Mike Brown not given dignity even in death, right? For 4.5 hours in Ferguson, Missouri, in the middle of a street, it is August, meaning it's hot. This young man is killed and he's in the street, and even in death, there's no dignity. He's not covered up. Many of you can remember that moment in terms of you're seeing these images that's going all over, whether it's on Twitter, it's already on Google before his family members and friends even realize what's happening. And one of the individuals, the protesters, says these words, is that they just treated him as if he was a nobody, as if he didn't have family and friends that loved him. And what I would like to suggest is that when we intersect Mike Brown, Dr. Hill's book in this moment, and into this moment, even right now, how many of our students are treated as nobodies, as if they do not have value? And I want us to understand how important that is. Again, not just from a philosophical or existential standpoint, because I'm gonna give us some research pretty soon, but love is important. But then, as mentioned, I have to tag Amy Cooper back into this conversation. And because of everything that happens, many of us have forgotten about Amy Cooper and her encounter with Christian Cooper. And Amy, and many of us are familiar, Amy and Christian, they're having this conversation, and Christian is saying some things to her, and she feels threatened. And when she feels threatened, she goes into her bag and she realizes some things that perhaps I could weaponize whiteness, or I could weaponize my privilege. And I could do this with the individual that I know from a historical and contemporary standpoint is viewed through a negative racial lens. And within this context of the United States of America, within this context of where we are right now in New York, that just might work. So here's the thing. When I tag Amy Cooper into this conversation, how many of us have been weaponizing our power over individuals that we perceive to be vulnerable? What she saw in the park, in Central Park, as she was viewing Christian Cooper, she didn't see a Harvard graduate. And again, let me park there. It should not matter, right? So often Christian Cooper, Harvard graduate, and we do that in terms of this exceptionalism, or you know what, in terms of because he went to Harvard, but it should be from the standpoint of just humanity, regardless of your occupation, because all work has dignity. No, she saw an African-American male, and she realized that perhaps if I weaponize my whiteness within this context, he's going to face legitimate threats. And that's for all of us to really think about within our schools, our classrooms, our districts. How many of us have been manipulating our power over vulnerable individuals? So I shared earlier that I get calls to deal with the so-called academic achievement gap. I go a little bit deeper and say, nah, I want to align myself with some of the theorists that says it's not an opportunity, it's not an achievement gap, it's an opportunity gap, right? Because if we're not careful, achievement gap also goes into, student A needs to be like student B, and if we could get student A to student B, then we've done something, right? So that's extremely problematic to me. But forget that language for a second. Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr., another phenomenal book, Democracy in Black, How Race Still Enslaves the American Soul. He talks about, we're having this conversation about the academic achievement gap, healthcare gaps, employment gaps, all other forms of gaps. But he says this, what we're not talking about is the value gap. The value gap is the reason that academic achievement gaps, employment gaps, healthcare gaps exist. And he frames the value gap as this, the value of meaning that white people have more value than others, right? Then he goes deeper in another classic book that was just released. He goes deeper, and the book is titled Begin Again, and he's talking about James Baldwin's America. So in many ways, the ways in which I'm co-thinking with Dr. King in my work, he's co-thinking and co-grappling with Baldwin in terms of the America that we're living in. And he says that the value gap is sustained in the lie, this lie that has been recapitulated within the United States. He says this, the lie is a broad and powerful architecture of false assumptions by which the value gap is maintained. So he says this, that the value gap continues to be sustained because we continue to lie. We continue to be in denial. This is just one of thousands of social media spaces in which students and alumni have really shared the ways in which they have been othered. And I'm lifting this up because I reside in the state of Delaware, and my daughter is a student within these network schools. And following George Floyd, everything that happened this past May, students and alumni, they were saying, these same issues exist within our schools where we don't feel loved. We don't feel loved. This past August, I was called in to kind of do a professional development, and I go into one of the schools in which these issues were kind of raised by students and alumni and some of the parents. And it was just disturbing to me that after the talk, teachers were still given the reason and rationales for why certain things may exist. Then I did a follow-up visit a month later, and I saw one student, she was calling out this young African-American male. He was in like the first grade and saying, "You're too handsy." And the students were out playing, with their little mask on, and having a good time, do what first graders do. But in the midst of this whole group, she could target this one African-American male, first grade. And he's the only one that's handsy and no one else is being handsy, as she would frame it, on the playground. And I would argue perhaps that's because of the value gap. It's just one example. So if we're really trying to get philosophical with this conversation in terms of the aspects of love and how it's related to the ways in which we engage our students, many of you may say, well, you know what? Love has multiple definitions in the Greek. So are you talking about, eros? Are you talking about storge? So to be very explicit, I'm talking about two concepts of love. Philia, meaning friendship. What I'm arguing is that we have to view our students as good friends and not just data points. Everything that we're seeing in our data points and our data, it's not just data. These are students, right? These are communities. But also from an agape standpoint, meaning unconditional love. Regardless of the conditions that our students are dealing with, we will not view them from a deficit perspective, but rather we are fighting hard to remove the barriers that exist. Not just currently, but even after this pandemic, we're saying we will no longer go back to business as usual. So as we're looking at it from a love lens, some of you may be saying, okay, this is too philosophical. I need some concrete evidence. Okay, how about the American Psychological Association? This is just one that I could render right now because of time's sake. But a few years ago, they published a report and it's titled The Top 20 Principles from Psychology for Pre-K-12 Teaching and Learning, talking about how the psychological is tied to or directly linked to student success. And you know what's in a report? It's something that many of us have been uplifting, that affirmation is important. Student sense of belonging is important, right? Expectations is important. Supporting students is important. How about this? Aspects of love. So what I'm suggesting is that we have to wrestle with the question, what does radical love look like within the context of pernicious racial attacks? What does radical love look like in this moment for you? What does radical love look like within this moment? Let me be more specific in terms of COVID-19 inequities, this ongoing pandemic. Breonna Taylor, or the lack of justice for Breonna Taylor. Many in our LGBTQI community saying that, you know what, we have also been others. Ableism exists. What does radical love look like in this moment? And before I get to the prescription, I got to tag King back into the conversation. April 7th, 1968, Dr. King, he sends the message to a secretary, and he says, here's the message for this upcoming Sunday. The title was this: Why America May Go to Hell. That was the message that he sent back in terms of, this is what I'm going to talk about this upcoming Sunday: why America may go to hell. That was supposed to be the message on April the 7th, 1968. Even for those that have no faith affiliation or a part of another denomination or religion, or even an atheist, can I suggest that even those individuals would say, hey, we need to get to the Ebenezer, because this is really going to be some sort of a message. But for those of you that knows history and dates, you know that he never got an opportunity to give that message because he was assassinated on April the 4th, 1968. So we never got an opportunity to hear what he was going to render on that Sunday morning, his arguments in terms of why America may go to hell. But can I say this? What I'm arguing, or have been arguing over this last hour, is that our refusal to understand the seriousness of the conditions outlined by me and others in the H.E.L. aspects of the H.E.L.P framework, the history, the difference between equality and equity, and the L is a precursor, forgive my language, to our schools going to hell, and too many of our students continuing to catch hell if we don't make drastic changes. The same way that Dr. King was going to share with his members and eventually the nation on April the 7th, 1968, his arguments for why America might go to hell is what I'm saying today, that our schools are going to go to hell if we don't understand that this history of racism and racist acts can no longer continue, that this confusion that we're having between equality and equity and how we're using equity language, but at best we're doing equality practices, can no longer continue, and also not understanding love and how that's tied to student sense of belonging and outcomes is very important. So what do? We now get to the prescription. But before I do that, let me just give a little bit of data. Why our schools may go to hell. Why is that the case? Because 87% of teachers, principals, and district leaders agreed that Black students, vulnerable students, continue to face higher rates of school discipline. Only 11% of teachers report that they have training and resources necessary to teach anti-racist curriculum. And nearly all US school districts, students of color outpace teachers of color. But then not only that, we still see that because of this teacher racial mismatch, it affects teachers' expectations for students and ultimately the students' level of achievement. Why our schools may go to hell. So what do? We're now at the P, the practical ways that we can operationalize this work, what I'm calling the prescription, one of many. This is just coming from my perspective. So I want to have a little bit of fun with this as I start to get to the end of this conversation, as I'm talking about the prescription. And I have to be very vulnerable in suggesting that in this season of my work intensifying, whether that's panel conversations, consultations, professional developments, you can name it, the weight of doing this work has literally led to increased weight that I'm carrying. And, you know, it really hit me, I would say this past July, where I went to put a shirt on and I got upset with the cleaners because I couldn't button the top button, and I got mad with the cleaners because I thought that they shrunk my shirt. And I realized it wasn't that. I gained a lot of weight. So like many of you, we started this new year and we're saying that, you know what, we have to do something different. 2020, we want to forget about that. We have to make some changes. For myself personally, understanding that self-care is so important, I said, well, you know what, I need to do some other things. I need to go back to getting a personal trainer. I do my own working out, but this is time for me now to get my own personal trainer. So a few weeks ago, I go in and I had to give an intake. And it was so embarrassing to me in terms of the questions that they were asking me. And I was getting, annoyed. They're asking me questions in terms of the water that I'm drinking. And they're asking me, what do I eat and where do I like to eat? And if you said, you eat fast food, how many times per week do you eat fast food? And where do you go to get your fast food? They're asking me about soda intake. They're asking me all of these questions. And quite frankly, the more that they were asking me these questions, I started to get embarrassed because I realized that, you know what, I'm sitting before these professionals and I have to be honest. And the more I kept talking, the more I realized I had some bad habits in terms of the food I was eating, how much I was eating, the places I was eating it from, my sugar intake. I could go on and on and on. But the point is this. They couldn't develop a plan or give me a prescription if I wasn't honest during the intake. So how's that related now to the practical? If you were to email me, or if you were to email so many other colleagues that are on this Zoom, or so many other professionals, and we're engaging in a conversation with you. You're saying that you want to go deeper with issues of equity and anti-racist practices, or an equity plan, or we could go from A to Z, from Z to A. It starts with our ability to be honest during our intake. So many times, again, I'm in conversations and I'm asking these questions and people are getting defensive. And folk are trying to, basically put the blame on others. And it's not about that. It's not about blaming, but if we're not honest during our assessment, then we're going to construct a plan that does not really directly align with what we need within our context. So, for example, Here's some questions. What are some of the equity and racial challenges? Not just the challenges, how about this? Not just a deficit perspective, but also the opportunities that you are dealing with within your educational context. So it's not just the challenges, but are there some opportunities? How about this? Number 4, very important. How committed is your organization to doing the work, right? So the question was posed to me, talking about, well, how committed are you? And again, I got so upset. I'm here. What doesn't that show I'm committed? Not only that, I'm spending money, right? I'm spending a whole lot of money. Doesn't that show that I'm committed? But as I thought a little bit deeply, just because I'm here and just because I'm spending money doesn't mean that I'm committed. And that relates to many of us. We're here, we're on the Zoom. Many of us have been on so many of these Zooms over the last 5 to 6 months. So many of us have engaged in these conversations, with our colleagues, maybe even with our family members and friends. For many of our district leaders, you're spending the money, right? But just because you're here and you're spending the money doesn't necessarily mean that you're committed to the work. So we have to be very honest in terms of when we have these intakes, that it's not about just your presence or your money, but how committed are you, right? And only you can honestly answer that, and your colleagues, your team. But then if we are saying that we want to go to the next level, can I say this? It starts with many of us, to get the sound information, we have to read, and we just can't read it one time. We have to continue to read. So you may say, hey, I want to learn a little bit more about culturally relevant or responsive pedagogy. Well, what about Dr. Gloria Latson-Billings? Are you familiar with her? Or what about Dr. Rich Milner? Start where you are, but don't stay there in terms of if you're thinking about, ways in which this is influencing your curriculum, right? What about the psychological aspects? If I had more time, I could really talk about stereotype threat and identity threat and really hit this conversation from a social psychology lens. So what about Dr. Claude Steels, where he talks about stereotype threat and identity contingencies in terms of how our identity within a certain context, right, in which that identity has been negatively stereotyped, we're all under threat or attack, and it impacts our performance. If we're talking about variation, and if we're talking about meeting students, all of our students, what about Howard Gardner's work in terms of multiple intelligence? So it really challenges us to read. What about Kendi's work, How to Be an Anti-Racist? I love Kendi's vulnerability and how to be an anti-racist, and also Stamp from the beginning, because how about this? Kendi is talking about his own biases and prejudice, even as an African-American male. Hashtag for the culture, for many of us that are saying, yes, we need to know a little bit more about culturally relevant or responsive or sustaining, however you want to frame it. I would suggest you have to start, because even though sometimes we lump culturally relevant and sustaining and proficient in reality pedagogy together, there are some nuances, right? So if you want to talk about culturally relevant pedagogy, you need to go to Dr. Gloria Latson-Billings. You need to read the articles. Culturally sustaining pedagogy, which Dr. Latson-Billings and Dr. Paris would argue is a remix to her theory, you have to read Dr. Paris. What about reality pedagogy? Dr. Emden. What about culturally responsive pedagogy? We have to go to Dr. Geneva Gay for my educational leaders. You may say, well, for those of us that are principals, our superintendents, what is our role? I would say you have to read the work of Muhammad Khalifa, Culturally Responsive School Leadership. Very important. But how about this? If I'm really going to be honest, this conversation, as much as I respect all of these individuals, it doesn't just start with them. For example, if we want to talk about cultural practices or the importance of culture and curriculum, can I go back to 1933? Dr. Carter G. Woodson, The Miseducation of the Negro, one of the most brilliant and phenomenal books ever written, that I would suggest in 1933, he was talking about these things that we're still grappling with in 2021. So how about that text? Going deeper, to be true to this conversation in terms of drum majors for equity and justice, despite the propaganda these last few months and despite the threats, we cannot be afraid of critical race theory. to look at the structural implications, to understand the tenets and how it's played out in our practice, right? And we have to read the works from some of the theorists. So, for example, critical race theory, an introduction, a phenomenal text that perhaps could be of interest to you. What else can we do? If we look at the intersection of critical race theory and how that relates and plays into education, it's a lot of people that have written on this work. So again, going back to Gloria Ladson-Billings' book, she writes this seminal article, What is Critical Race Theory and what's it doing in a nice field like education? And then Dr. Horsford, in her book, Learning in a Burning House, she's coming at it from a critical race theory perspective. And she's arguing that, you know what, we need to understand racial literacy in education, which she's saying we have to be fire preventers. Racial realism in education, that we have to be first responders. We have to understand that these things, are existing, and we need the skills. Racial reconstruction in education, she's talking about we have to protect life and property. And oftentimes this life and property, they have been explored through an inferiority lens in terms of people being put out there in terms of they are inferior or they are others. And then racial reconciliation. How do we get towards racial healing and harmony? For many of us, we're familiar with Robin DiAngelo's work. Robin DiAngelo's work is so important, right? Where she talks about white fragility. And what she argues is that white fragility is the defensive reaction so many white people have when our racial worldviews, positions, our advantages, our questions are challenged. Many of us are familiar with DiAngelo's work. I really respect her work. I really respect the ways in which she's putting her work out there. And I would even argue the context in which her work is. DiAngelo's work is important, but it's not the end all be all. So as much as we're talking about white fragility, some of us need to switch to white rage, which is Dr. Carol Anderson's work, right? And we're not talking about Dr. Anderson's work, where she's talking about white rage is the structure of racism that has brought about white anger and bitterness towards Blacks, especially when social progress has been made. So I know that many of us, the ways in which she writes, her vulnerability, and even her approach towards presenting, has been really attractive. And again, not trying to downplay her work, but are we now ready to get to white rage after white fragility? Oh, how about this? White rage before white fragility. What else? We must find ways to center questions of race, racism, and inequality in the curriculum, even right now in a virtual space. So what does it look like in terms of for our students to understand Mendez versus Westminster, right? Brown versus the Board of Education, that's in it. What about integrating James Baldwin into the conversation? Because I believe he has a lot to say. When we're talking about Women's History Month, what about the contributions of girls and women? Right? How about this from a hip hop lens, if some people would say, but I would argue it's even deeper than that. What about integrating Nipsey Hussle and Tupac into the conversation? As mentioned, we cannot have a discourse around what I would call self-regulated learning without integrating Malcolm X. But going back to the workouts and the personal training analogy, where I'm at, the intake is just step one. Because now when we construct the plan, we need to make sure that we have a solid foundation. And I'm not ashamed to say, like many guys, and again, I'm not trying to be stereotypical. Let me put that out there. But I have to admit, as someone who identifies as a male, oftentimes when I go to the gym, I work on upper body, work on biceps or chest or my shoulders. And maybe I may give 2 minutes to legs. So during my intake, and as I was going through the workout, the personal trainer, he stopped me and he said, here's one of the problems. You're focusing too much on developing upper body strength, but if you want to develop upper body strength, it starts with your foundation. So he says, we really have to work on your legs because your legs is the foundation. When your legs are weak, it's not going to be able to support the rest of your body. So what are you saying, Dr. Whittaker? What I'm saying is this. For many of us, We want to put all of our investments into a professional development, a book study, consultants, committees. But after that, we need to think about, but do we have a strong foundation so that this work is sustainable? Why is that important? Because we need to realize we need a correct analysis, that the system is not broken. We have to stop the language. It's not broken. For many of my students coming in, the system is broken. We need to fix it. The system is not broken. It was designed that way. When we're talking about improvement inquiry, the central law of improvement is this: every system is perfectly designed to deliver the results that it produces. So the things that we have seen, the things that we will continue to see if we're not courageous enough to deal with the system, will cause us, again, to be top heavy, but a weak foundation, which means that nothing is going to be sustainable. We have to understand the system implications and be committed to developing infrastructures that sustains the work that we do. Another way of saying this is, let me give this example. When I'm talking to individuals, I'm saying the work that we are designing today, we're trying to make sure that we're creating infrastructures that 10 years from now, the work is still sustainable, even if the people at the table no longer are a part of the school or the district. What else do we need to do? A correct analysis causes us to go deeper. Again, foundation. Going back to Dr. Love, forget this academic achievement gap language, but if we're going to talk about that, the academic achievement gap, according to Dr. Love, is not about white students outperforming dark students. It's about a history of injustice and oppression. Let's name it. That goes back to the H. If we're not courageous enough to name, we can never frame. So if we're going to talk about academic achievement gaps, let's make sure that that's connected to the history of injustice and oppression. What else do we need to do when we're talking about our foundation? And for many of us that are designing plans and we're on committees, we need to ask the right questions. This comes from Dr. Harper's work, Sean Harper, who is a professor at USC. And I love Harper because he's really challenging us to ask the right questions. Oftentimes, what he suggests is that we're having these deficit interventions and these deficit approaches because we're asking deficit-based questions, right? So he challenges us in terms of not saying, well, how come these students are underperforming or continue to underperform? That's not the question. He challenged us to really think about what interventions or what resources do we need to put into place to ensure that all of our students, are experiencing equity. That's just an example. So how are we asking our questions, or how are we framing our questions? If we're talking about foundation, another aspect related to that is that we need to understand that we need to really think deeper about our strategic diversity plans, our inclusivity plans, our equity plans, whatever you want to name it, right? So when we're talking about an inclusivity plan, according to Williams, we need to understand our phases. All of this work is not going to be done in 1 year. We cannot talk about over 400 years of inequities being totally dealt with in one academic year. That's insane, right? So we need to think about these phases. Year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4. What are our goals? Then when we think about our goals, what are our tactics that's going to help us to achieve the goals? How about this? What are some benchmarks for success that we need to think about? What about progress indicators and outcome indicators? So these are the things when we're thinking about our diversity planning, our equity planning, that we really need to include. Not only that, we need strategies for hiring practices. So as mentioned, Cabrini University, we are proud, we are excited to be in partnership with the Pennsylvania Department of Education, most recently with the Aspire to Educate grant, where we're really thinking about diversifying the education workforce within Cabrini with our teacher candidates, but ultimately throughout the Commonwealth, right? So this is work that we were engaged in before A2E came about, but definitely when this opportunity really presented itself, where we started to think about, not just in the School of Education, but at Cabrini, how can we go even deeper with this work? So for some of you, you're probably saying, this is where we need to go. So I want to put this out there. For those that are in HR, or those that are leading committees, what about partnerships? If you're really committed to diversifying your education workforce, what about partnerships with HBCUs, historical Black colleges and universities? Can you think about ways in which perhaps you can start to form those relationships? Because according to the data, HBCUs, they're doing a really good job in terms of pumping out and developing these great candidates. What about Hispanic serving institutions? For others, is that a pipeline program that can exist between universities and K-12? Right? So you need to be real intentional in terms of the partnerships that you're really thinking about if you're committed to developing these long-term inclusivity infrastructures. So, as mentioned, we have to move beyond symbolism to substance. The moments where we're just coming together and we're having a talk and someone cries and we're making all of these commitments only for it to go nowhere, those days are over, right? Because according to Derek Bell, trinkets and symbols, that's what he would say, right? It's nothing more than trinkets and symbolism. My colleagues and I, a few weeks ago, we used some other language. We said DEI blackface. That can no longer exist. But then I want to end with this as we're talking about the P, the practical, the prescription. After the intake and the embarrassment that I had to deal with as I had to share and be honest about some of the things or the behaviors that I was engaged in terms of my nutrition. And after I dealt with the foundation as we went through a workout assessment and they found out that I had a weak foundation, then we went to the core. And what the trainer said is that the core is the key to everything because the core is going to keep you stable, right? If I was to intersect Dr. King into this conversation as I close, the core is going to help us to no longer be distorted or in denial. So we have to recognize unconscious biases that exist within ourselves and within our own context, right? When we walk around the school, once we're physically in them, even right now in a virtual space, we need to think about, are there ways that we're putting our work out there and that we're teaching and we're putting our messages out there that still uplifts our biases? So we need to do some audits. We have to realize that on the Zoom today, we all have privilege. White privilege, male privilege, heterosexual privilege. And we need to think about, is our privilege continuing to wreak out on our students and our communities? Because as mentioned, if we're going to be stable with this work, if we're not dealing with biases and privilege and microaggressions, because there's nothing micro about microaggressions, because microaggressions have macro impact, this is the core, right? A lot of what I gave you throughout is the head, right? But now I'm dealing with the heart. But then I would like also to suggest, as I shared that I identify as someone that comes in the Black prophetic tradition, I'm also suggesting that we need educational prophets in these times. Going back to February the 4th, 1968, Dr. King reframes the conversation towards the end, and he says, but if you want to be a drum major for justice, how about this? How about you thinking about ways that you can be a servant? Because we all can do that. I want us to get rid of the savior mentality and think about the ways that we are serving our students, right? And serving our communities. And even when I say that, perhaps many of you, there was something that you felt internally because that language bucks up against your privilege, my privilege. But I want us to think about servants. If you want to be important, he says, wonderful. If you want to be recognized, wonderful. If you want to be great, wonderful. But recognize that he who is the greatest among you will be the servant. That's what he argued February the 4th, 1968. Will our students and our alumni, will the parents, will they say that, you know what, this school, this district, they are committed to serving? But then I want to end also, if we're going to be true to being an educational prophet, he says these words. If you want to say I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice, say that I was a drum major for peace, I was a drum major for righteousness. And all these other shallow things will not matter if I can help somebody as I pass along. Here's, at the end of the day, students, alumni, parents, community members. You think that they're super excited, are going to continue to be on fire because you're on the Zoom today? Or that because I'm writing and teaching these things? It's not about that. It's about us being committed to justice and peace and righteousness. But then he says this, because he's also coming in the tradition of a prophet. If I could cheer somebody with the word of song, if I could show somebody he's traveling wrong, then my living will not be in vain. How about this? I want to end with this. Not for many of us, perhaps not individually, but collectively, we have been traveling wrong. But we have this moment right now that we could turn things around collectively. If we're courageous enough, if we're honest enough, if we're vulnerable enough to say, no longer can we continue to keep traveling wrong. And then only when we're that honest, will our education practices will no longer be in vain. With that being said, thank you so much for the wonderful opportunity to share. I know we probably have a few minutes for questions, but once again, Dr. Nicole Holland-Sims, your colleagues, everyone, the committee, thank you for the wonderful opportunity to share my work. Thank you.
Dr. Whittaker, the pleasure was ours. And that is in true and honest and authentic love, genuine love for the work that you do, for the time that you gave, for the wisdom that you shared. The chat is lit up with positivity. And so I just wanted to convey that one apple doesn't spoil the bunch. And so we will focus on the positive and the great work that you've been able to provide. There are a couple questions. And so if you're okay, we'd like to pose a few to you.
Great. Well, I would try my best. I would definitely try my best to answer or to shed, a perspective on the questions. Thank you.
Absolutely. So we have one that says, let's say our educational community is prepared to start these conversations, but there's pushback by the local community, such as parents or even parents with racist beliefs. How do we balance this change without losing community support? Do we start with community or school, or do it simultaneously?
Right. Wow. That's a really, powerful question. And that could take us all day. So here's the thing. I push us back to being ethical and making sure that we have integrity with this work. If your school or your school district, if you're committed to doing the work, you have to, you can't be unstable with this thing, right? You cannot be lukewarm. So you have to make sure that you are truly committed to doing the work. After that, I do think it's important in terms of the messaging that we're putting out there. Even though it may be pushback, right? I think there's some ways in which we're saying, here's the reason why we're going out with this work, because you're trying to build that place of connection, right? And for some individuals, if we're going to be true to this work, some folk will never get the moral or the ethical implications of this. Right. So there are times where I talk about the business case for diversity. Even in my communication that I'm putting out there, it's not trying to that I'm trying to water down my work. That's not the case. But I understand that communication is important, and then also understand that even within that community, perhaps there are some influencers that is, pretty much stirring up some things. So be true to your work. Be true to your communication. And what I would like to argue, if we're coming in the prophetic tradition, oftentimes prophets are not celebrated presently, but down the road, We are uplifting prophets. As mentioned, Dr. King, 1968, he dies a depressed man, a beaten man, an unpopular man. In 2021, Dr. King, he's the best. Everybody's saying that. That wasn't the case in 1968, but he said this: even if folk leave me, I'm committed to this work. And you have to understand, it's not about today that I'm so much focused on that. Yes, it is about today. But it's a both and, today and tomorrow. So a lot of the resistance that we're feeling today, that we're experiencing today, if we just stay true to our mission, stay true to our values, we're going to start to see some things change.
Thank you, Dr. Whittaker. I'd like to present the next question, if you're okay with that.
Yes.
Okay, when leadership is polite, not interested in discomfort, but may sincerely think they address this conversation with a training or an underutilized committee, in effect, this is not really changing us or changing our practices in a way that makes much sense or any difference. How do you suggest educators who work under them work within this leadership style or organizational culture toward moving through the HELP framework?
Right. Wow. So let me just say this. Whoever put it out there, as mentioned, I would frame this as DEI blackface, right? Symbolic. It's symbols of democracy, symbols of change, but it's not deep rooted. So for that particular individual, one of the things that I put out there within your area of influence, your classroom, if you're in the classroom or whatever area of influence you have in the district, you continue to move forward. But I think what I'm also hearing is a professional question, right? I think it comes a place, if we're going to be true to this work, can I do it within this context? Because here's the thing, if you can't do your best work within a context, believe me, the professional dissonance and the professional pushback that you're feeling or experiencing, it's going to seep into other aspects of your life. So as much as this work is difficult, I do know that there's a whole lot of other districts that are committed to doing this work. And you can have support. So again, both and. Do what you can do currently within your area of influence. But if you realize this is a place where unfortunately it's nothing more than DEI blackface, this is a place where we're not committed to the foundation, meaning the infrastructure. This is a place where we want to come at it from the exclusive standpoint, from the snobbish standpoint, that we don't want to go deeper and grapple with the HELP framework or other frameworks, critical frameworks. Perhaps this is a place where you can no longer be. And I hate to be that bluntly, but it's the truth, because it's too important for us in this moment, and our students, too important to fail. That's the documentary by Dr. Tavis Smiley from years ago. But it's this moment, it's too important to fail.
Great. We have a few questions that kind of mirror each other, so I'm just going to use this one as probably to get the best answer for the multiple ones. Okay. So for instance, in this district, it says we're feeling pressure from former graduates and current parents to make the change in the district right now. We have a committee of stakeholders and have stressed the importance of being mindful about what we do to address inequities, particularly around race, but we're still being pressured to make major changes now. What advice do you have for our district to address this group, former students and parents, and better help them understand the long-term goals?
Right, definitely. So let me say this. That goes to some of the areas, some of the things that I really raise, particularly with the H, in terms of understanding when we decide to have these conversations, or for many of us, we were pushed into having these conversations, that we received an email or some sort of a letter that we could no longer overlook it. Understand that just because you form a committee or you say that we're going to address it, that that's going to end everything. That's not the case, right? It's not the case. And part of, gaining that support is to be honest. We have to be honest with our community. You know why? Because we've been lying for a long time. And the students realize we've been lying. Parents realize you've been lying. You've been lying to us, right? So we have to be honest. Not only do we have to be honest, we have to be vulnerable. What do you mean by that? So it's not just the successes that we put on the website, that we closed this gap, or we did this. What about even the things that we've fallen short with? We have to be vulnerable, right? But then not only that, we also have to understand that this is going to be a marathon. For many of our students, parents, community, they have suppressed so much stuff. And they're saying no more, right? We are going to continue to speak out because we have suppressed this mess for a long time. How about this? For many of our students, it's not just the students, it's the parents, because the parents are also been a part of these districts, are dealt with these racial stereotypes, and they have their own trauma that they're dealing with. So understand that this is going to be a long-term journey, one in which we have to focus on what can we do now, right? But also realizing that we have to be committed to developing these plans. And how about this? And if we're going to be committed to doing a plan for any superintendents or other folk that are dealing with finances, if I have CFOs, your commitment is also tied to the money that you invest. Can I say that again, right? If you're going to be committed to doing this DEI work, it's not going to be for free. You have to be committed. You have to be committed to getting those consultants. You have to be committed to getting the expertise at the table that can help you out. You have to be committed to invest in resources. So all that to say, I guess to tie it all together, communication. It goes back to communication in this moment. Be honest, but also in being honest, you also have to be vulnerable, right?
Thank you. Here's another question. Understanding the importance of acknowledging their own bias and influences, what recommendations do you have for hiring practices of teachers, administrators, and staff, or professional development for current teachers, administrators, and staff?
Yeah, so, wow, whew, yeah, these are some super awesome, like these questions are just terrific. Here's what I would like to say in terms of there needs to be, if we're talking about hiring new candidates into the district, teachers, educational leaders, we need to go deeper with these equity questions, not just the fact, have you had a course? Not just the fact, are you comfortable? Okay, in which ways have you operationalized equitable practices within your experiences, whether that's a student or if you're coming from another district? I need to see this, right? I need to understand, I need to see within your curriculum, like who are you integrating into the curriculum, right? We need to do some on the spot case studies, right? In terms of you read this case study, you bring it back, right? And I want you to dissect the case studies. So these are all of the things that we really need to think about in terms of hiring committees and the ways in which we are assessing. How about this? Now, if we're talking about assessment, for our veteran teachers, and this aligns with the work that we're doing with PDE, but I do think that districts and schools, you have to be receptive, right? To some of these toolkits is going to be put out pretty soon in terms of the ways in which we are assessing teachers, the dispositions, the rubrics, right? But then here's the other piece. I think it then goes back to some of the earlier questions: students, parents, community leaders. Are we providing space for them to assess us, right? In the business world, we would call this like 360. Right? So we're looking at assessments from different perspectives. So are we also open to our students giving us feedback, our parents giving us feedback, the community giving us feedback in terms of the ways in which we are operationalizing our notions, some of the things that we said that we were going to do around equity and anti-racist practices? And this is why I say this work, there's no way you can sprint past this moment. We have so much work to do, and we have to be open to looking at other perspectives if we're really going to develop this infrastructure.
Thank you. I really love that there is so much work to do. And you mentioned it too, Dr. Whittaker, and Amir and I see it out in the field. People want to jump right to P. Mm-hmm. And so in that jumping, they're missing such a critical piece that you've noted. And I'm hopeful that our listeners are really grappling with the framework as it stands and how important it is to start with the history.
Right.
This next question kind of lends itself to it from a different perspective. And so it resonated with me, and I just want to get your thoughts on it. As a person of color, I take issues with mandated race and equity training for people of color. I am aware we all have our own biases, but based on the reason why these trainings are being issued and mandated, I feel uneasy. I feel people of color are forced to relive trauma that might be associated with negative experiences. It puts us on display as a problem to solve. So the first question this person has is, Am I wrong for having this unsettling feeling? And the second part is, how do I and other people advocate for this realization in a constructive way?
Wow. I wish we had so much time. I
Me
mean, these
too.
questions are just powerful, right? So let me say this. I'm really true to my work, right? Issues of race and racism and white supremacy. But people ask the question, so, when you do these workshops, you're really giving it to these white teachers, right? And it's like, yeah, and right? Because as mentioned, white supremacy operates in Black and brown bodies, and in some cases, white supremacy operates better in Black and brown bodies. When I go into certain schools and students are being labeled, this is again pre-COVID, thugs, it's not oftentimes, it's not so much, sometimes it's from teachers of color and administrators of color in which they are being labeled, right? And why is this? Perhaps if we look at the psychological aspects of it, if we look at the critical race theory aspects of it, is because we all have been duped in terms of thinking, if I get these symbols, if I get this status, then perhaps I arrived. And if I arrive, I don't want to identify with this group. So let me say this. I would suggest we all need to go deeper. When we talk about, where's this at? Kendi's real vulnerable in his books. Kendi's talking about, look, me too. I also have my own biases and my own prejudice. Let me be very honest. So when Kenny's talking about how to be an anti-racist, he's talking about it's contextual. And depending upon the context, we could all go from being a racist to anti-racist, or from an anti-racist back to a racist, because it's contextual. He's vulnerable. But being true to the question, I would say this. Oftentimes, as people of color, we're in these conversations, and it is a whole lot of trauma. Here's the thing. As mentioned, I really appreciate Robin DiAngelo's work. I think it's phenomenal. But to me, Robin DiAngelo is speaking to a particular audience. So when if you talk to me about Robin DiAngelo, I would argue, I don't know if I necessarily want to be a part of that conversation, because there's some things that rises up inside of me. So the point is this: when we're doing this work, we all have triggers. And that's the part of being introspective, where we all need to think about our triggers. But then the flip side, as I think about, and I don't know if I'm really answering the question the right way because this was so many layers, so whoever posed the question, please forgive me. But I would say, as we think about the last aspect, what I looked at, how I kind of am perceiving that is strategy. And when we're looking at strategy, I think it's very important for us to really think about the various approaches to liberation. Because when we're talking about people of color, and if I could just talk about specifically a group that I identify with, African American, right? When we look at it, even from a historical standpoint, in terms of freedom fighters and the liberation movement, if we were to be honest, from a historical standpoint, there was infighting. There was a whole lot of fighting. SCLC versus SNCC, right? Nonviolence versus the Black Panther Party, right? Black Panther versus the Black Power movement. And sometimes we conflate everything in terms of it's all that. No, there's also been struggle. So I think that even from a strategic standpoint, history would suggest that there's never been no alignment, because if there was an alignment, perhaps we wouldn't be at this place. So it causes us, even though we may feel as though I know this, well, perhaps we need to look at it from different perspectives. So for example, let me just give this, being vulnerable myself. There's a debate between Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. 12 years ago, don't talk to me about Booker T. Washington. I hate him. He's the worst thing ever. But I've grown. And in my growth, I started to think, wow, well, perhaps I wouldn't have done that speech the way he did it, but there was some stuff that I think he was spot on about. And I had to humble myself and say, I think his philosophy does speak a lot to what I'm currently seeing. So there's a constant growth that's going to come. And that's why I say we're all on a journey. I teach this, I write articles on this. No one has arrived. That's just one example in terms of where I had to switch. And I know we're coming up at 12, so I don't want to hold anyone, but I would love to continue the discourse, if we have another question or so.
Yeah. Amira, did you have another one?
Yeah, I had another one that I thought was interesting, and I wanted to get your feedback. How do educators who are in classrooms or those who may be a coach get past looking good on paper and actually apply the optics of a district-wide equity plan? How do we operationalize the work that needs to be done where there are no clear indicators of success outside of the gaps?
Yeah, absolutely. So, wow, I would say that's the core, right? That's the core right there. We done went from intake to foundation to the core. And even if you're in a district or a school that's bringing in these coaches and somehow you pass, and they say that you're the person, like like everyone needs to go to classroom 211, right? Whoever's in classroom 211, when you get in the car or when you log off, you know what you're still dealing with. And for us, here's the thing, is this just a job or is this personal to you? Is this, because how about this? Again, I always like to reference books because I like the model when I'm saying, if we get to Bettina Love, when she's talking about abolitionist teaching, I can give you the theory, but what she's arguing, it's a way of life. Is this a way of life to you? Right? And I think that's a personal question. Currently, we have 598. I know at one time, what was it, over 700 here. If we put it out there, guess what? If it was 771 people, we're going to get 771 different responses. But this has to be a way of life. It's not just a check off, right? Because here's the thing, even if you get a check today, it doesn't mean that that same check is going to continue tomorrow, because it's contextual. So are you committed to the profession, and are you committed to living these beliefs as a lifestyle? One example, last week, everything happens and Twitter's going crazy. People are putting things on social media. And some of my colleagues, you're texting me, but very interesting, you weren't putting anything out there. Why was that? Perhaps because if I put something out there, this crosses over into another part of how I identify that may be at threat. So I would rather text you in this moment than put a tweet out there. So if we're going to be honest, Dr. King would say we're complicit. So it's been great. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Goodness. This is good. Someone said, can we keep you another 5 minutes? I do have one last question, Dr. Whittaker, and then we will let everyone go. And I think it's important because I know from working in the field, Americans share this too. We get this a lot when we do trainings. What are some strategies to implement this work without offending stakeholders? So for example, when you talk, and you did this so well, you talk about race and you say, this is my lived experience and this will be the perspective that I come at this from. But when we hear from folks, it's, well, why is this only about race? Why aren't we talking about gender? Why aren't we talking about poverty, et cetera? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so let me say this. So my perspective really does deal with race. At the core, I have to argue that, to me, the reason I'm talking about race is because we never talked about race, right? And we haven't talked about it substantively, because we wouldn't be here if we could just deal with the race. Here's the other piece. I think even in this moment of equity, sometimes we're trying to, okay, well, we want to talk about race, but we'll call it DEI. So in many ways, we're still not dealing with the issue. We're still getting away from the issue, right? We're moving away to make everybody comfortable. So therefore, we deal with nothing. So my perspective, I'm a race scholar. That's what I'm going to talk about. But guess what? There are other people to do the work, and we need to be open to hearing from their perspective. I could talk about, I mentioned sexism in my work, but you know what? There are some scholars I need to listen to. There's some educators. There's some girls and women I need to shut up and I need to listen. When I want to talk, when I need to think about male fragility and patriarchy, I'm not the one to talk. But then, as I really say, and this is the complexity, as we're starting to put these puzzles together, and this is why I say it cannot be a short-term thing, this work is also intersectional, right? So for example, Black Lives Matter, right? We use, are we saying all Black lives? Or just some? Black Lives Matter, and are we for it with Dr. Whittaker because it's 7 degrees and in books? But are we open to hearing from others that perhaps their lived experiences are even more rich, right? So all that to say, the work is intersectional. How do we talk about, the intersection of race and gender and sexual orientation? So as we start to go deeper, we realize that, this is so complex that we need to listen to multiple perspectives. The problem is when we just try to lump everybody together. But then within the context of my work, the problem is when we try to overlook and jump away from the problem of the color line, as the boys would argue.
Perfect. I appreciate that so much. I know, again, speaking for many of us that do this work alongside you in the field, that was really important to hear because it helps us to give language to some of that pushback that we do get.
Right.
So, Dr. Whittaker, I want to thank you. I've said it throughout the session.
Thank you so much.
It was phenomenal. I'm so thankful again that you were able to give us your time and your expertise.
Thank you so much.
As a matter of housekeeping, folks, if you've paid attention in the chat, if you were seeking Act 48 credits today, there is a link that has been placed in the chat. Please feel free to complete that. We will need you to have that completed by January 15th. And we hope that you have a great rest of your day. Please do not hesitate to reach out to any of us at the PaTTAN system if you have any questions about today's session. And we will obviously connect you with Dr. Whittaker based on the appropriateness of the question or the concern. And so—
Right, no cussing, by the way.
No, absolutely not. If you could hang out for a minute, Dr. Whittaker, we're going to bid everyone else adieu, and we'll ask the panelists to stay on. So everyone have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.